Hi, I'm with Tim Scheuer. I'm Chuck Wood, and we've been getting some questions about training churches and Timothy churches. And so Tim and I are just going to have a discussion on this, and we've prepared some slides. And so I'll talk about what I've done in the past, why I'm doing it, how I'm doing it, and then Tim's got some good questions for us to ask. Tim, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, thanks, Chuck. It's great to hang out with you. I'm living in Sydney, Australia, and I've been on this journey for a number of years of trying to multiply disciples and churches to grow God's kingdom. I'm married to Jenny, and we have four adult children, a couple grandchildren, and we work with Move with Steve Addison. Although he's left the country, he's now living in England. And we've got a great growing group of colleagues and partners across Australia and New Zealand that are joining the growing group of people with that vision for no place left in our towns, cities, and countries. So it's great to be a part of something that God's doing globally, and very keen to learn everything we can to try to do this job better.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Well, as I look at the training church first, uh, it really is designed to train existing believers in a very short period of time, and we just want to get them into the harvest, making disciples, planting churches, and developing leadership pretty quickly. Now, this can be a supplement to an event training where we're doing level 1 or level 2 training, or we can do this in lieu of a training event, and it's just a weekly rollout. And so we train as we go. It's kind of like on the job training. We want to model exactly what church looks like. What I've found is that a lot of people are doing these trainings, and it may not be a training event, but it's kind of where we gather a few people, talk about training, and then send them off to do something completely different. It's kind of like firing blanks. We want to use real bullets, so we want to model exactly what church looks like and send them on the way to do exactly that. We also use a 3/3 process and short-term discipleship in order to facilitate the church. And then it can meet weekly or bi-weekly, and we can do an every other week type of scenario where you train 1 week and then you send them in the harvest to find a house of peace the next. They come back and train again, and then the off week they're working with that house of peace, trying to stand that up to a church. And so every other week works really well with people that have very busy schedules. If they can, we'll do it weekly and just do it on an off time. So we'll train on a Tuesday night, and then they'll work with their house of peace on a Thursday night. And really what we're shooting for is competence and confidence in starting a church. That's what the training church is all about. And so that's a training church, what it is. The reason why we want to do this is it's a great jump start for existing believers. You may come into a legacy church and there's a bunch of people that really want to get going. And so you take them, you train them just like you would do church, and you launch them. Legacy churches can start a skunk work. They don't have to flip their whole congregation upside down. They can just take this small cadre of people in their congregation and do this on the side until it gets traction, and then they can start to introduce it to the rest of the congregation, and that alleviates a lot of friction with change and upheaval and those kind of things for new paradigm. This really gives the trainers the opportunity to assess and evaluate the trainees. A lot of times people can't make that jump to a new paradigm. And so as a trainer, you need to be able to see that and move in different directions. And so you can very quickly see if somebody's going to get this T for T paradigm or not. And if they're not, then that gives you the opportunity to move to another place and train them. If they do get it, again, this is a very short period of time. So you launch them very quickly. And again, you can move on and start another church. The how-to is basically you model exactly what your trainees are going to do. You do church and you be the church. You don't play church. You are the church, and you don't just talk about it. You're doing it. And you delegate the 3/3 process to them as fast as you can so that they can grapple with the components and they can do it and they can learn. And then they're reproducing that in the harvest as quickly as possible. And then if we do the every other week schedule, then that gives them the opportunity to go into the harvest. So that's how we facilitate the training church. So Tim, why don't we take a break before we go to the Timothy church and see, do you have any questions or comments about the idea of a training church?
Yeah, that's great, Chuck. Thanks. I guess thinking about what you're saying is the goal that each participant in the training church will learn how to start a church of their own. Um, is that something that you want them to agree to up front? Uh, as you're forming that group of people into a church, or is that something that you think is going to happen? They're going to get that vision and begin to have that paradigm shift during the process of being in the training church?
I think it's something that you definitely want to give them a heads up on beforehand, but having some kind of contractual agreement, no need to do that. Really, this is called precision harvesting. You just like Jesus, he'd throw it out there and see what stuck. And so, you get a group of believers, they're keen to do this, they're curious. Okay, let's get together, and then as they go through it, they're going to make the determination. Now, if you're an extremely busy trainer, I can see the merit in coming to an agreement beforehand. If you don't have much time and you're training a lot of people, you may have to see who's really serious up front. So it can go both ways.
Yeah. So, Chuck, a few times you mentioned very fast. So here we got, let's say, believers coming from an existing legacy church.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they've done no or very little training. They're coming into a training church with an expectation they're going to learn how to make disciples and start a church. But there's a lot of paradigm shifting that needs to happen,
Mm-hmm.
and it may or may not happen. So how fast is very fast? Like, what's a realistic expectation
Yeah.
to allow that kind of paradigm shifting to change? And then how would you let people out if you find out, hey, this, they're not really up for this, they're not willing and possibly able to make that shift?
Yeah, make sure that people have the option to opt out at any time, but then leave the door open for them to opt in later on. I can't tell you how many people we've had that no, I don't think I want any part of this, and then a year later they come and knock on the door and want to get trained. So don't burn any bridges, but be very free. You opt in or opt out. So As far as the definition of very fast, that's kind of relative, but when we did this with the Legacy Church, within 3 weeks, we were in 5 houses apiece in the neighborhood. Within 5 weeks, we were doing DBS in 3 of those houses. And so we were standing up churches within a matter of 8 weeks. So that's pretty quick. Now, every group is going to be a little bit different, but I probably wouldn't do a training church for any longer than 6 months. I'm going to give them the time that they need, but as a church planner, just like Jesus, just like Paul, I'm going to move on pretty quickly. That's intentional as an apostolic church planner. So let's say anywhere between 8 weeks to 6 months is pretty quick.
Wow. Okay, so you're also talking about delegating the 3/3 very fast. So let's say you've got your short-term discipleship set that you're taking this training church through. The people in it haven't been through those lessons, but you're wanting to delegate to them as much of the 3/3 as they're able to do. How do you navigate some of those challenges?
Okay, so the first week I model. The second week, almost every believer knows how to pray, I hope. So the second week, I'm delegating the prayer portions of the 3/3 process. By the fourth week, they're starting to get things like accountability, vision casting. My vision casting is super simple. Quote the Great Commission and tell me what you think about fill in the blank. Authority, go, make disciples, nations. So by the third week, somebody can do that. Read the Great Commission and ask the question, tell me about the word go. What does that mean to you? Very simple vision casting. The second third, I'm probably going to do that for quite a while so that they can get the hang of storytelling and then asking the sword questions and facilitating. I'm going to model that. That's probably the most complicated piece of the whole 3/3 process. But you can delegate the storytelling by week 3, week 4. You know, hey, this is our story for next week. Read it, be prepared to tell the story. And then the final third, practice. Third, fourth week, they're understanding what they're practicing. They can certainly help people set goals and then, of course, pray. So if you approach it with delegating the easiest components first and keep modeling the more sophisticated parts, but by week 5, you should have them doing most of the work. Now, is it going to look perfect? Is it going to be pretty? No. You will have some messiness in there. So you just have to live with that and let them fail forward, just like we did and doing
Mm,
right now.
mm, mm. So it seems like one of the powerful aspects of this is you're not in a classroom environment. You're actually in a living church environment.
Right.
What are some of the pitfalls and challenges that you've experienced that people should be aware of as they're trying to implement this kind of church environment?
Good. I think one of the things that you don't want to do is you don't want to start with the stories of hope with believers. Now, if they need the stories of hope to get into the house of peace, I do one story of hope and they have the format and then they can go for it from there. What I find with believers, if you go on with the stories of hope and then all of a sudden you switch gears and you start the commands of Christ, you have a lot of people opting out of the church at that point. might as well set the bar high from the very beginning. So that's one of those things that you want to look out for. Make sure that people realize the expectation is for you to reproduce every part of this here in this church, and that you're going to start another church. If we're not going to multiply churches and we're just going to have another Bible study, me as an apostolic church planner, I'm not interested. I want to reach the lost. I want to penetrate lostness in our city, our state, our countries. And so I really don't have time for another good Bible study. So make sure the expectation up front is clear. We're going to reproduce. And make sure that you're modeling well and then delegating quickly. And so you're going to model, assist, watch, launch or leave, and then stay in touch, even with the training church as you go. So those are some things that I think you got to watch out for.
That's awesome, Chuck.
Okay. So let's go on to the Timothy church. Now, a Timothy church is completely different, and I think this is where I've muddied the water. I've put a little bit of confusion because I use both terms, but I never use them together. They're completely different. A Timothy church is once I start to see a church planting network develop, I'm going to identify the leadership, the future leadership, and I'm going to pull them into a church. One of the mistakes that I made early on in the process was I did leadership meetings, and that completely violates what we're trying to accomplish. So the Timothy church is to gather your future disciple makers and church planners. We're going to meet on a regular basis. Jeff Sundell and Nathan Shank, they say these are your 60 to 90 day guys and gals. They're the people that you're doing life with. And when you're doing church together on a regular basis, well, now you're spending time with them in the very context that you want to see them do. So you're modeling this. And so it's not a leadership meeting, it's church, and you're modeling church for your Timothys. Now, Timothys need guidance, encouragement, and development. And a lot of times this is such hard work, and sometimes even within the same city, they feel isolated. And so they get lonely, and they need to be around a group of people that are doing the same thing. They're all in this together. And when you get Timothy's doing church like that, it's electric. It's super encouraging and inspiring. So we're doing church together. Now, you can raise up leaders doing one-on-one. I'm not against it. But I would go with a both and approach. I would get your leaders in church. There's a lot of synergy when we come together as church, and high potential for cross-pollination. When I used to meet with one-on-one leaders exclusively, I would forget to say things, or I'd walk away from that meeting saying, oh, wow, I wish I would have been stronger in this statement. Well, when you meet as church and the leadership is a community type of forum, then you get the prophets, you get the evangelists, the shepherds, the teachers, the apostles speaking into this. And the question that you may have forgotten to ask will be asked by somebody else in the church. And so the development is much more potent, I think, in the church context. And so this becomes your community of best practices. And even though I like that name, I'd rather call it church, because that's what we're after. We're after church. So how we do it, we do church together. That's the first thing. I give clear guidance and expectations to the Timothys so they know where we're going and when we're doing it. The Timothys in that setting get it. A lot of times we're assuming our Timothys get it and they're out there flapping in the wind. When we do church together, they're getting it. People say more is caught than taught. Well, when you're modeling, they're catching it. And this is, you're going to model the commands in short-term discipleship, but then you're going to move into long-term discipleship. And for instance, most of my Timothys are apostolic in nature. So we have an apostolic long-term discipleship. That's our thrust, and that's the direction that I want to take them in their leadership development. And very quickly, they're going to take turns leading the church. It isn't going to be me leading every single time. The Timothys will lead the church, and now it gives you an opportunity to assist, watch, launch, and stay in touch. You've modeled it. Now you get to see them right there in their church, in our church, doing the things that they're going to be doing with their churches. And so it's an opportunity for immediate feedback on how they're doing, what they're doing well and what they can do to improve. So that's the Timothy Church, Tim. What comments or questions do you have on that?
Yeah, well, one of the questions is, so you've got some Timothys that are raising up in an area, in a region. They're going to be busy people. How often do you think they need to be meeting together for it to be useful? Weekly, once every 2 weeks, is once a month enough to gather them together for it to be a useful experience?
Yeah, I think once a month will work. Some is better than none. So as much as you can get, our Timothy Church meets weekly, but not everybody can get there weekly. So most people will show up somewhere between 2 and 3 times a month. So with busy schedules, we just leave it open. Show up when you can. And we meet at a regular time that's consistent so people can build their schedule around it, but they don't have to show up every single time. Now, you might have to do some backfill in your training if people are missing some very important things that you're covering in church that day. But that's okay. Then you just delegate that to one of your Timothys and they redo it, and repetition is good for all of us. And you get to watch your Timothy instruct or lead you through the second, third in whatever particular leadership module you're doing that week. So you often is good, but we do realize we need flexibility for people that can't make it every single week.
Yep. So what would we say, I guess two related questions, are the key differences between the training church and the Timothy church? And what about the prospect, like if you don't have enough people really for a standalone one, of combining a Timothy or two with people that aren't yet identified as Timothys, combining them together?
Okay, I haven't even thought about that, but a thought runs quickly to my mind is that good. Now your Timothys, you and your Timothys are going to do a training church together. You're in the harvest together. So you just get with your Timothys ahead of time, and they, along with you, do the training church for them. Now, mind you, this is only going to be short-term discipleship, and you're going to launch that training church very quickly. So potentially you and your Timothys could do this several times, but you really need to get beyond short-term discipleship with your Timothys and get into the developmental discipleship to help them become the leaders that God means them to be. So, yeah, I think you can do both, but you're eventually going to have to get to that long-term discipleship with your Timothys.
Yeah. So that seems to reveal a key difference. If I'm hearing you right, is that a training church is going to be fairly short term. You said maximum 6 months, because you get trying to get people launched out themselves out into multiplying disciples and starting and multiplying churches. Whereas a Timothy church, you're really taking people who've, they're a bit more proven. They bought into the paradigm. They've proven faithful. You've got a mutual agreement with them, and there's an intention of a deep, longer term investment. So that Timothy church potentially is going to go a longer term to be able to provide the kind of training and development that they're going to need to keep them sustained in fruitful ministry.
Yeah, exactly, Tim. And this is a huge deal with our coalition practicing T for T. This is one of the greatest needs across the board, that we identify, win, and equip Timothys. But if there are no Timothys, there are no generations. First, we got to have babies, and then we got to train those babies up to be mature adults. So if we never get them to maturity so they can reproduce, then we're in trouble. So you've just touched a nerve that in fact, that's why we're doing this video. We have got to concentrate on our Timothys. Good.
Okay, that's awesome. Hey, I that's about all the questions on Timothy Church I have, but I did have a question back on Training Church. Do
Sure.
you want to hold
Yeah.
that or
No, go for
flick
it.
that out? And this is just a pretty practical thing, and it's a situation I'm currently dealing with. So I've got a new training church, and we're meeting for our third week now. I've got a couple people coming in the third week for the first time. How have you effectively dealt with those kind of situations? How do you manage that? What do you do?
Yeah, with a training church, you really don't have enough time to go back to the beginning or split up in smaller groups. And this group does command one and this group does command two. You're really looking for people to get the gist of the process and then be able to hand them the simple guide to taking someone through the short-term discipleship with the 3/3 process. But you really don't have time to do that. Go back, split into small groups. You're just trying to get them to know the process so they have the framework to hang any command, any story, any Bible study on it so they can reproduce it. Now, if you were talking about a long-term church and we have new people coming in, what I do is I take those new people with some of the old folks and they bring them up to speed in the commands of Christ weekly until they get through the commands, and then we rejoin as a congregation. Now, some of our congregations are 25 people, so they're breaking down in small groups anyways in the house, and that's good. So, but that's completely different than a training church. A training church is on the fast track to understand the process. So, if that's helpful. Now, people can do whatever they want. I'm not the expert. This is just my thoughts and what we've done. So,
Yeah. Well, that's really good, really helpful, Chuck.
all right, my brother. Well, as folks see these videos, if you got questions for Tim and I, we're on Facebook and we have emails, and you know how to get a hold of us. Put your comments on the videos. And it was good hanging out with you, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. Great hanging out with you.